Well, I hope that you enjoyed that first session of Can I Trust the Bible? And it is my great privilege to introduce you to Wesley Huff. He's our Ontario director with Apologetics Canada. And I'll let Wesley kind of introduce himself and give a little bit of his academic credentials.
Yeah, so I am the director of Central Canada for Apologetics Canada, so that covers Ontario and Quebec. I've been working with AC now, had the privilege since 2021, and my area of expertise, as we've just seen a little bit of within that first episode of the series, is in regards to the Bible. So my PhD is in early Christian scribal culture, and I look at the history of the text of the Bible within the earliest manuscripts that we have. And so we got the unique opportunity when we went out to Egypt to see some of those manuscripts and talk about and see some of the places that they were discovered. But that's my passion and my interest.
And you're in the final stages of your doctoral work at Toronto, University of Toronto.
Yeah. So trying to wrap up my dissertation on manuscripts.
That's great. When we were in Egypt, as we were saying there, it was challenging. Not only did we travel over 200 kilometers to get to these remote locations to film, but we did so in 45-degree heat and even in sandstorms. And one of the things that we began to realize is why there is so much archaeological treasures in Egypt. And there's actually a really startling quote that you told me when we were there that still shocks me.
Yeah, they think they've only uncovered about 1% of all of ancient Egypt. So there's still a tremendous amount. We still don't know where most of the pharaohs that ruled ancient Egypt are buried. And they're still pulling tremendous amounts of mummies and artifacts out of the sands, and some of the museums we went to were just stuffed.
It looked like a hoarder's home.
Yeah, it really did.
Archaeological cool stuff.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that's interesting about it is the conditions there are so difficult and honestly deadly that it makes a great place to preserve archaeological stuff. You can only go there in the winter to dig and to try to even get anything out of the desert. But this also makes for great conditions to preserve these documents, doesn't it?
Yeah, the same reason why we're digging up mummies that are 2,000-3,000 years old from the sands of Egypt is the same reason why the vast majority of our earliest biblical manuscripts, particularly New Testament manuscripts, are also being pulled from Egypt. It just has to do with the arid climate. It's just so dry that it preserves this stuff in the sands so well in a way that it just wouldn't in other locations.
When we arrived in El Qasr, they told us that it was sprinkling, it just sprinkled. And they said that was the first time that they had seen rain all year. And I was like, oh my goodness.
When we drove from Cairo to Luxor, our guide who was with us was kind of perplexed as to why we would drive. And he said, nobody drives from Cairo to Luxor. They take a plane. But we were going to some of these really remote locations that were on the way, but he was like, nobody does this. You're the only people. And I think, do you remember how many times he said he'd actually done it? It was maybe
like twice.
once.
Yeah, once or twice, yeah. People don't do that, and they shouldn't do that, we learned. You shouldn't do that. One of the things that I've noticed over the years as I've talked about the Bible and as I've helped people just to think through can I trust the Bible, is oftentimes people will approach the Bible from a 21st century perspective. So much so that they just assume that the title of the Bible is Bible, right? They don't realize that that's a Greek word for books. Nor do they appreciate that the Bible that we have today isn't the Bible that the early church would have had. And even to talk like that would be a little bit odd. What would the early church have had?
Yeah, or not in the medium that we think of it, because we have the great benefit, living in the 21st century, to have our Bible in a single bound volume. All of the 66 books are in one place, whereas the early Christians would have understood Scripture, Holy Scripture, as encompassing individual books, individual scrolls or codexes. That's just a Latin word meaning books, because academics like to use Latin words.
But that's an interesting point. Codex was an invention, like a book that you and I understand, binding them together was an invention.
And it wasn't very popular in the ancient world. Christians didn't invent the Codex, but they 100% popularized it, to the point where when Christianity is decriminalized under Constantine in 313 at the Peace of the Church, they come out of the woodwork and they're able to produce books at a more public level, and they actually influence the way that books from that point on are produced and disseminated and published. And secular works or non-religious works start to take cues from how Christians have been producing books for the last really 200-300 years.
Now, on that note, a question that we hear a lot is, when and why did the early church need to formalize the Bible?
Yeah, this is a good question because we can often just assume, much like we have a Bible in one single bound volume, and so we assume that's how it's always looked, we can assume that these were just the books that should be there, and we don't often think of how did these books come together. But the canon of Scripture, and canon is just a Greek word that means rule, and the idea was that these are the official rule or standard of books that we think of as Scripture. And in one way, we think that there could have been a vote or a choosing of those books, when in reality it wasn't as much a choosing of the books as it was a recognizing of the books that were handed down to the apostle. So there's a New Testament scholar who likes to say that if you were to go back in your time machine and you were to find those second century Christians and you were to ask them, hey, why did you choose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? They would have looked at you and kind of went, what do you mean choose? We didn't choose Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John any more than we chose our parents. You know, why did you choose your parents? Well, that's a silly question, right? They would have said these were the books that were handed down to us by the apostles. And so the question of what book should be in what we consider the Bible was a question of examining these books and doing the due diligence of tracing them back to the apostles and the first community that was within the community of Christ.
Now, one thing that we talk about in this video is that there were other books that were found. Books like the Gospel of Thomas and others. And we tell a little bit of the story of how the Nag Hammadi library was found. When we found those books, was that a surprise to us? Was that the first time we'd heard about these?
Yeah, a lot of these books, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Philip and Peter and Mary, we actually knew about them and had known about them for arguably about 2,000 years, because the early Christians were aware of them and were writing about their content and that it was heretical. They were warning other Christians, hey, this is not something that reflects accurately what Christ actually taught. And so for a long time, we didn't possess the actual document, but when we found the Gospel of Thomas, it didn't change anything about how we understood the Bible. What it did do is it confirmed that what guys like Irenaeus, this early church father in the 2nd century, was saying about the Gospel of Thomas was actually true. He said, there's some heretical and wacky stuff in here, and then we find it, and what do we find? There's some heretical and wacky stuff in there. And so when we find these documents, in fact, there are still some we don't know of. There are writings that the early church condemns that we don't have evidence for. But when we find them, what is it going to confirm? It's going to confirm exactly what they were warning against 1,800 years ago.
You know, it's interesting. I was reading a quote from Eusebius where he talks about another church, an earlier church father that came across a church that was reading from the Gospel of Peter, a false gospel, and he said to the church, "That's not the real gospel." He's like, the real gospel is the ones that have been handed down to us from the apostles, and so they called that out. It's like they weren't aware of it or didn't say anything.
Yeah, Serapion of Antioch, who was the bishop of Antioch, which is in modern-day Turkey, and he writes to this community. They say, we found this book. It has Peter's name on it. Should we read it? And he goes and he reads it, and he says, no, don't do that. And we didn't find the Gospel of Peter until really the last 200 years. And we've only found one copy, but it's exactly what Serapion warns against. He says there's this idea within it that is heretical, and what he describes is exactly what we found when we found the actual document.
Now, one of the things, Wes, that you talk about in the video is Walter Bauer, and he was arguing for this idea of Christianities. Was there a theological quagmire?
Yeah, in one way, the answer is both yes and no. That's a good academic answer, right? Yes and no. It's yes in the sense that we did have these other groups like the Gnostics, the Docetics, the Ebionites, who were appropriating Jesus for their own means and putting words on the lips of Jesus. And so in that sense, there were contending groups. But I think when you read individuals like Bauer, he really plays up the significance of that. He plays up the fact that there were these groups, when in reality, these were fringe minority religious groups located in very small pockets across the ancient empire. And you do have early Christian writers, like I mentioned, Irenaeus, who writes treatises against them. But it's not because they're so popular. It's actually because these early Christian leaders are making sure that they're warning the early Christian community against false teaching. And they've heard of these pockets of this false teaching. But it wasn't a quagmire as much as it was just kind of little bubbles here and there across the ancient world.
And I think in some regards that shouldn't surprise us. You have to appreciate that Christianity, as it grew, was wildly popular. So we shouldn't be surprised that people were going to springboard off of that popularity. I mean, for us, it's a little bit different in that when we plagiarize today, we're taking somebody's ideas to make ourselves famous, whereas what they were doing was, they were taking a famous person to make their idea famous. They weren't trying to make themselves famous, but the theology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we should expect that there are groups, like there are today, that will appropriate Jesus for their own means. We see that today, and we don't say, oh, well, now Christianity is in contention. We look at that and we see, there's an obvious difference between the real deal and a facsimile or a complete counterfeit.
Wes, a term that we often hear is Apocrypha. What does that mean?
Apocrypha just means strange in Greek. So apocryphon is just a word that means strange, and it's a word that the early church grabbed onto to describe anything that was outside the canon. So apocryphal literature refers to anything that wasn't included within the scriptural canon. But it's a kind of a blanket term, but it's largely used to refer to, in the New Testament Apocrypha, these books like the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, and other ones.
Now, there's another kind of set or genre of books as well that this might surprise you or shock you, but early Christians liked to read, and they liked different kinds of books. And what's interesting about this is just because they liked a book, and one of the books that they liked, for example, is the Shepherd of Hermas. They liked that book, and they would even quote from that book. But because they read that and because they quoted from it, doesn't necessarily mean that they thought it was scripture. In the same way, Wes, if you go to a Protestant sermon these days, you're probably going to hear C.S. Lewis quoted at some point, right? But that doesn't mean that we think that the Chronicles of Narnia should be a part of Scripture, right? sorry to tell you this, But yeah, we like Lewis, we like reading Lewis, we like quoting from Lewis, but we clearly understand that Lewis and Scripture are different.
And there were actually groups who kind of questioned this. Is the Shepherd of Hermas, should it be part of Scripture? And so there were discussions where they did that kind of legwork of saying, okay, well, can we trace it back to either someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus? Because that was really the clincher benchmark of what came to be referred to as Scripture. Can we tie it directly to someone who knew the apostles? And we have these conversations where individuals say, we can't do that with Hermas. In fact, they say specifically, we know who Hermas is, we know his brother is a church leader in Rome, and he has no direct connection with anyone who was an immediate follower of Jesus during the first century. And so even if some might have considered it scripture, when they actually started to investigate this, they said, this doesn't actually fit the standard and criteria of what we consider to be that which is God-breathed, being passed on from Jesus to his immediate disciples.
Should we be bothered that Paul quotes from Greek philosophers or Jude quotes from Enoch?
No, we shouldn't. Because, like we would quote from C.S. Lewis, we're drawing on material that people would be familiar with, that people would relate to. And so when Jude, the only unambiguous quotation of the book of Jude is from the book of Enoch, when we look at that, we don't need to then conclude that Enoch is scripture. What we can look at that and conclude is that this was a piece of Jewish literature which was very popular. Yeah, Jude is drawing from it to make a particular argument, and he's drawing from material that would have been frequently understood and used in the same way that someone like Lewis is being frequently used and talked about in the Jewish community. Or when Paul is speaking to Greeks, he quotes Greek philosophers and uses material that they would have been familiar with to make particular arguments that would make sense to them.
This kind of goes back to the Apocrypha question, but where did the extra books in the Catholic Bible come from?
Yeah, so that's a good question because we do have a category of books that are sometimes referred to as the Apocrypha, and that's sometimes referred to as the Apocrypha Formal. So those are Old Testament books, not New Testament books. So Roman Catholics will refer to them as the Deuterocanon, which means second canon. And they would say, I think accurately, this doesn't mean second in reception or second in influence, but second in reception. So basically what we have is between Malachi and Matthew, the last book of the Old Testament and the first book of the New Testament, you have a period of 400 years. Now it's sometimes referred to as the 400 years of silence, but that's a bit of a misnomer because there was a lot being written during that time, especially in Jewish history. And so you have these books being written, books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Tobit, and so on. And what it comes down to is for the early Christians, they were looking and they were seeing, okay, we have what's referred to as the Jewish scriptures, the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, what we would call the Old Testament. And you have this other group of books, which is written after that group that the Jews considered scripture. What do we do with that? And for a lot of people within the early church, they looked at that and they said, the Jews never considered that scripture. The Jews were entrusted with the oracles of God, like Paul says, so therefore we don't consider them scripture. Now the 66 books of what we would refer to as the Old and New Testament in our Protestant Bibles were never under contention. But if you look at the reception history of the Bible throughout church history, there's always discussion and back and forth. It's not unanimous. There were popes throughout history who didn't consider them scripture. And even up to Martin Luther's day, there were individuals who were hostile to the Protestant Reformation who likewise didn't consider them scripture.
Well, let's expand on that a little bit. Like, what were some of the books that were in contention, and what were some other books that just weren't included?
Yeah, so 1st and 2nd Maccabees is a good example because what it does is it chronicles a period of history where the Greeks have conquered the ancient world and Israel falls under that. And what happens is the Greek emperor, the Greek king, comes in, he conquers Jerusalem, and he actually takes hold of the temple, and he sacrifices a pig on the altar of Yahweh, which is a big no-no. And this is appropriately heretical and blasphemous. And so what it records is a group of these Jews, led by an individual named Judas Maccabeus, who goes in and he kicks the Greeks out, he reclaims Jerusalem, and then he rededicates the temple in a ceremony, and then that's where we get the story of Hanukkah. And actually in John 10, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Dedication, that's Hanukkah. And so what 1st and 2nd Maccabees chronicle is this period of time. So it's a very important book for Jewish history. But the question is not, is this a recounting of true events that actually happened? The question is this being spoken with a thus saith the Lord statement? The ancient Jews never thought so, and a lot of Christians throughout history, leading up to the Reformation, when the Protestant reformers, guys like Calvin and Luther and Zwingli, look back on this history and they say the Jews never considered them scripture, therefore they should not be in the contention for this question. So the Protestants unanimously say, we're going to stick with the 66 books that have never been in contention. And then the Catholics, in response to that, that's when you have this official pronouncement of the deuterocanonical books being included in the Catholic Bible.
On that topic, what was the timing of the New Testament books coming together and forming the collective Bible?
So that's a great question. I think we can say by the mid to late 2nd century, all of our 27 books of the New Testament were more or less agreed upon. We have collections very, very early on, within the early 2nd century, of the fourfold Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being collected into a single codex, a single book, and the letters of Paul being collected into a single codex, a single book. And then we have what are called canon lists. So lists of what people thought were the books, and most of these include the 24 of the 27 books we consider the New Testament. And by the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd century, that's when you really have everybody more or less agreeing on these are the books that we recognize as scripture. And even the books that were in contention, books like 2nd and 3rd John, books like 1st and 2nd Peter.
Revelation would be in there too.
Revelation had a very early reception history, and then actually as early Christianity moved away from ancient Judaism and into more of a Gentile movement, they started to not know what to do with Revelation. Because ancient Judaism has a context for apocryphal literature, and the Gentiles don't. And so that's when they're like, okay, we don't know what to do with these dragons. And so they have questions
Not sure
about
we
that.
know sometimes
Yeah,
what to
sometimes
do.
I don't know what to do with the dragons either. Ask Troy if you have any questions. You can ask Bradley. But part of that is that these books that are in contention are not in contention because they don't think that they're scripture. What they're really trying to do is do the due diligence. Can we trace this back to the authors? So they knew that they could do that with books like the Gospel of Peter. Even though Peter's name is on it, they can't trace it back to Peter historically. So then you have two letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. They also have Peter's name on it. So they went, okay, let's hold on, let's slow down. Let's wait for the dust to settle on the kind of research that we need to do. And so that's why those books took a little bit longer. But by the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd century, you have 24 of the 27. And then really by the wrapping up at the beginning of the 3rd century, I think we can definitively say that's when we have our New Testament.
What do we do with those books that we don't know the author, such as the book of Hebrews?
Yeah, so I don't think that's as big of an issue because Jesus quotes books from the Old Testament that we don't know who the authors are. We don't know who the authors of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings are. And yet there's a recognition that they're still scripture. So I think there is a question about, say, books like the book of Hebrews, where for a period of time it was ascribed to as Pauline, and then there were some questions later on, but it's not directly addressed as from Paul, like Paul's other letters. But I think the question is less, can we definitively say who the author was, and more, can we tie it back to the earliest apostolic community? And I think with a book that's anonymous like Hebrews, we can definitively say that, and so we can still connect it to the earliest Jesus community despite not knowing the author.
A question that I'm seeing come up a couple times here is on the order of the books. So like the order of the Old Testament, the order of the New Testament, does that match what the Jews would have had? And has it always been that order, or has it been changed? What do you think about the order?
Yeah, so that's a discussion that starts to happen later on, because once again, even the question assumes that the order that the book that we're reading has an index, and that we can look up the order of the books. For a long time, they were just independent books. You would go in the synagogue and you would pull out the scroll of Isaiah. So the question of the order starts to become a question when they all start being formalized in a single book in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries and onwards. And those questions start to come into purview when they start to ask, how should we order these? In what way? And so for the Old Testament, we have the same 39 books in our Old Testament that are in the Jewish scriptures. If you buy a Jewish publication of their scriptures, it will be the same books that we have in our Protestant Old Testament, but they will be grouped in a different order. So they have not a different number of books, but a different grouping of books. So we split 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings. They don't do that. They order the prophets in a different way. And so we just, through reception history, have developed a different ordering, but they're the same books. And with the New Testament, there was early agreement that the Gospels are the biographies of Jesus, put them first. And then you have Acts, which is the follow-up to the Gospels. And then you have the letters that come in different orders, but eventually all sort of formulate into what we would consider and look at the 27 books of the New Testament.
Well, as we wrap up this first Q&A time, one thought that I think would be just helpful is to go back to one of the things that we talked about in the video and just make sure everybody's clear on, because I think this is such an interesting point, and that is when we look at the popularity of names in that geographic location at that time, we see in the Bible that we often would probably take for granted why people are given nicknames, or even their names are changed, or their family is mentioned in it, is because those are popular names. And so they need to distinguish who they're talking about. And let's just tease that out one more time. How does that help us date it? I'm just hoping that people appreciate how the Bible does this, and they just help people to realize, this is why they're using a nickname.
Yeah, because names that are more frequently used and are more popular, if you're calling out and there are 5 Andys in the room, you need to know that you want to contact this one or not contact this one very specifically, right? So you figure out a way. So I say Andy S. or Andy Steiger or, different bald Andy. We figure it out, right?
It's funny because I had a friend, one of my best friends was actually named Andy, and I never even thought about it till years later because we would always just use last names.
Yeah, or some sort of physical descriptor, and that's what you see exactly in the Gospels. When names are popular, you see this disambiguator or this qualifier. And when we look at these studies and we look at things like grave sites or listings of names in the Dead Sea Scrolls or other ancient writers like Josephus, we can then narrow down a list of what the most popular names are in different geographical areas, in different times. And it really is shocking that the Gospels and Acts get this right every time and that others don't. The Apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels, they don't get this kind of information right, and they out themselves, as we said in that first session, as coming from different places in different centuries because of the names of background, ancillary characters that they describe. And so this is something that really helps when historians are trying to pinpoint geographically and on a timeline, where do we think this is happening? Can we narrow this down as early eyewitness testimony from a specific area, or is it being written in later decades and centuries by people who weren't even there? Well, when we can look at something like names, something that we would really skip over from our 21st century perspective because it doesn't necessarily mean that much to us, but when we crunch this data and we look at how it compares, we find that, no, these are names that are being used, that are being listed in the places that they're claiming to be used and listed in the times that they're claiming to be writing, which really just is like a beacon pointing to first century Galilee and Judea.